von den Angeklagten, soweit sie in meinem Blickfeld lagen, die ersten militärischen Berater Hitlers.
In the quiet suburbs of Dresden stands a villa that once belonged to Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the man who surrendered at Stalingrad and defied Hitler's final order. Officially, nothing remarkable was ever found within its walls. Unofficially, it became one of East Germany's strangest post-war mysteries. Locked rooms, concealed stacks of papers, private correspondence, and clues to a life torn between devotion and treachery. Yet the documents were swiftly sealed, the records buried, and the truth locked away in archives that have never reopened. But now, it will finally be revealed, and what it uncovered are things Hitler never wanted us to see. The fall of the Field Marshal, who wouldn't die for Hitler. The winter of 1943 was not merely cold, it was merciless. But the story that followed this torturous weather is one that involves a hidden room and lots of secrets. Across the shattered ruins of Stalingrad, snow fell like ash over what used to be streets, now just trenches of ice and bone. Tanks lay half buried in the frost, their steel bodies cracked open like frozen carcasses. Inside what was left of basements and cellars, German soldiers clutched their rifles and letters from home, their breath rising in thin white clouds that hung in the still, dead air. The city had stopped being a place. It had become a graveyard of men, of pride, and of the German Sixth Army. At the center of that frozen hell stood a man who had built his entire career on control. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had never been a battlefield brawler like Rommel or Guderian. He was a strategist, a perfectionist, the sort of officer who preferred a clean map to a muddy trench. Before Stalingrad, his reports were models of precision, neat handwriting, crisp margins, every line of attack calculated like a mathematical equation. War, to Paulus, had rules, geometry, discipline, logic. But there was no logic in Stalingrad, only chaos. By late 1942, his Sixth Army was encircled. The Soviets had launched Operation Uranus, a pincer movement so devastating it snapped shut around the Germans like a steel trap. Within days, 300,000 Axis troops were surrounded. Supplies were cut off. Communications faltered. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees Celsius. What followed wasn't war. It was slow annihilation. Hitler, sitting hundreds of miles away in his wolf's lair, refused every plea to withdraw. Stalingrad must be held, he declared, to the last man and the last bullet.
Hitler swept forward to congratulate his victorious troops.
Paulus obeyed at first, because that's what soldiers did. He was loyal, methodical, and bound by duty. But even the most disciplined mind begins to fray when the world turns into an endless white cycle of hunger and death. Inside the cauldron, as soldiers called it, discipline dissolved into desperation. Horses were eaten, then dogs, then wallpaper paste boiled for its starch. Men froze in their trenches, holding onto rifles that no longer fired. Letters home were written not to be mailed but to preserve some scrap of humanity before the inevitable end. And yet, Hitler's orders kept coming. Hold the city. The absurdity of it might almost seem cinematic now, but back then, it was madness with a stamp of authority. Then came January 30th, 1943, Hitler's own birthday gift to Paulus, a promotion he made him Field Marshal of the Sixth Army. It was not an honor, it was a threat wrapped in ceremony. No German or Prussian Field Marshal had ever been captured alive.
At that time, the image of Germany and the Germans in the world has changed, and the shadows of the past are omnipresent.
The message could not have been clearer. Die with dignity for the Führer, rather than surrender. But Paulus didn't. He was starving, exhausted, and watching tens of thousands of men perish around him. The myth of German invincibility had already frozen to death in the ruins. Suicide, to him, wasn't courage. It was vanity. As a devout Catholic, he saw it as a sin, and perhaps deep down, he knew that dying for Hitler would not redeem anything.
After Hitler's suicide and the Wehrmacht's capitulation, images of the crimes committed in the name of Germany.
So Friedrich Paulus did something unthinkable for a German field marshal. He surrendered. When the news reached Berlin, it was met with stunned silence, then rage. Hitler called him a coward. Propaganda ministries quietly erased his name from broadcasts. His portrait was removed from offices. Officially, he was dead. Or rather, he had to be.
Film footage, not associated with the Nazi propaganda, documents the horrors of war and the atrocities committed.
Germany needed martyrs, not survivors. But Paulus wasn't dead. He was cold, broken, and very much alive, sitting in a Soviet interrogation room, trying to make sense of the ruins of his command and his faith. At first, the Soviets didn't parade him like a trophy. They treated him like a puzzle. Here was the highest-ranking German ever captured, Hitler's own Field Marshal, alive and defeated. What could be gained from him? He was moved to a secluded compound. No beatings, no cameras, just questions. Quiet, persistent, and precise. Soviet interrogators knew how to wait. They didn't need to break him with force. Hunger and time would do that.
Civilization that's ever been encountered, and this was because the Third Reich set out.
For months, Paulus refused to cooperate. He wouldn't denounce Hitler or Germany, but isolation corrodes even the strongest convictions. When he learned that Hitler had publicly branded him a disgrace, stripped him of honor and memory, something inside him shifted. The man who had once lived by loyalty realized he had been discarded by the very system he had served. That was the moment he stopped fighting. In Soviet hands, Paulus became a weapon, not of steel, but of influence. To the Soviets, he was a victory in uniform. To the Germans, he was a traitor. To himself, perhaps, he was just tired of following orders that led nowhere but death. And yet, behind his public statements, Paulus remained an enigma.
Germans after the end of the First World War becomes one of his priorities.
Was he truly converted, or simply performing to survive? Some of his former comrades insisted he'd been re-educated. Others whispered that he was acting, waiting for a chance to return home. After years in Soviet captivity, the political winds changed. Stalin died in 1953, and the Cold War's landscape began to rearrange itself. The time had come for the Soviets to display their prized prisoner one last time. This time, not in chains, but in quiet exile. They released Paulus, not to West Germany, where he might have found redemption, but to East Germany, a land still rebuilding from ashes. His new home was Dresden, a city once known for its art and architecture, now known for its firestorm with scars still ran deep, and there, on a hill overlooking the Elbe River, stood a cream-colored villa. His new home, Preuss Strasse 10. To the public, it was a sign of gratitude, a peaceful retirement for a rehabilitated officer. To those who understood how the East German state worked, it was a controlled environment, or, as one former Stasi agent later described it, a comfortable cell with curtains.
Organized all over Germany, such as here at the Monument to the Battle of Nations in Leipzig.
The villa had history. Once owned by an affluent Dresden family, it had been seized by Soviet officers after the war. Paulus never saw his wife again. She remained in West Germany, and letters between them were censored or lost. And in those last years, perhaps he began to reflect, not as a soldier, but as a man who had outlived every oath he had ever sworn. On February 1st, 1957, Friedrich Paulus took his last breath inside his quiet villa in Dresden. The East German papers offered him brief, sanitized farewells, polite lines about peace and dignity, carefully skipping over Stalingrad, surrender, and the shadow of betrayal. The world had already buried Paulus once, in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. Yet 3 years later, the Nuremberg courtroom doors opened, and there he stood, the ghost of Stalingrad, alive. Captivity and conversion, the ghost of Stalingrad. When the doors of the Nuremberg courtroom opened in February 1946, the world froze for a moment. The man who stepped through them was supposed to be dead, a casualty of Stalingrad, buried under ice and rubble. Yet there he was, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, gaunt, pale, and wearing a simple gray suit instead of a uniform. His eyes looked sunken, as if he'd been carved out of the very ruins he'd once commanded, people whispered.
How did the victims and the children of the war criminals view the Nuremberg trials 75 years on?
Some gasped. The British journalists called him the ghost of Stalingrad. The Americans simply stared. And among the German officers sitting in the dock, a few turned away, unable to meet his eyes, because the man they once called Herr Feldmarschall had come back, but not as one of them. Paulus's capture had been quiet. There were no parades, no dramatic confrontations, no photographs of surrender. The Soviets simply escorted him away from the freezing ruins of his headquarters in the Stalingrad department store. The Red Army, for its part, understood exactly what it had. Not just a field marshal. The Field Marshal, the first in German history ever taken alive. The prize of all prizes. But unlike other captives, Paulus wasn't tossed into a barracks or a camp. He was driven hundreds of miles east, away from the front, to a heavily guarded compound. There, Soviet officers treated him with a peculiar mixture of respect and scrutiny. He had private quarters, books, decent food, even an adjutant. He was both prisoner and guest, or perhaps more accurately, a specimen under glass. The Soviets called him the trophy general. At first, Paulus refused to speak. He didn't cooperate, didn't answer questions about Hitler or the German army. He spent his days writing notes and redrawing battle maps, not for the Soviets, but for himself. He clung to order, to routine, as if that alone could keep the chaos out. When they handed him newspapers with stories of Nazi atrocities, he pushed them aside. When they offered him radio broadcasts condemning Hitler, he refused to listen. But the Soviets had time, endless time. They isolated him, let him stew in silence, and then they began to feed him information. Carefully chosen tidbits meant to chip away at what was left of his loyalty reports of his soldiers dying in captivity. Letters never delivered. News of Hitler's rage when he surrendered. One day, they told him that Hitler had stripped him of rank and honor, calling him a disgrace to Germany. Paulus didn't respond, but he didn't sleep that night either. That was the first crack. Eventually, he was moved again, this time to a villa outside Moscow. There, the tone shifted. The guards became less hostile, and his new visitors were not soldiers but scholars, priests, and German communists who had fled the Nazis years earlier. They debated him. They challenged him. Some spoke of conscience, others of betrayal. They painted Hitler not as Germany's savior, but as its destroyer. And Paulus, still a Catholic, found their arguments disturbingly logical. The Soviets didn't demand confessions. They offered reasoning. It was psychological chess, and Paulus, the old strategist, recognized the board too late after the failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944. The plot involving some of Paulus's own colleagues. Something inside him finally shifted. When he heard that men like Klaus von Stauffenberg had been executed as traitors, he muttered. They were soldiers. They acted with conscience. From that moment, the silence ended. By late 1944, a new voice appeared on Soviet radio. Unmistakably German, precise, calm, authoritative. "This is Friedrich Paulus," it began, calling on the soldiers of Germany to end this meaningless war. To Berlin, it was treason of the highest order. To Moscow, it was gold. The man who had once led 300,000 Germans into battle now urged them to lay down their arms. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-backed group of captured officers and exiles who condemned Nazism. Some believe his transformation was genuine, a moral awakening after realizing the scale of Hitler's crimes. Others think it was survival dressed as conviction, a calculated performance by a man who knew which side had the food, the warmth, and the power to keep him alive. Even the Soviets weren't entirely sure, but they didn't need certainty. They needed a symbol, and Paulus fit perfectly. 3 years later, when Paulus walked into Nuremberg, that symbol came to life. He took the witness stand on February 11, 1946. The room was silent. Here was the architect of Stalingrad, now testifying for the prosecution against his own comrades. His voice was soft but steady as he detailed Hitler's interference in military operations and the impossibility of the orders from Berlin. When asked about Hermann Göring's promises to resupply the Sixth Army by air, Paulus gave a bitter half-smile. "It was fantasy," he said. "We were promised an ocean, and we received a puddle." He didn't rant or accuse. He spoke like a man reciting the autopsy of a nation to the Allies. His words were validation. To surviving Wehrmacht officers, they were betrayal. When the day ended, Paulus left the courtroom quietly. Reporters tried to question him, but he only said, "I served a criminal regime. I bear my part of the guilt." Then he disappeared again. This time, back into Soviet custody, Paulus was not released after Nuremberg. The Soviets kept him in a guarded residence near Moscow. Officially, he was a consultant on military history. In reality, he was still a prisoner. He even spent a brief vacation in Crimea, which some Soviet officers joked was for services rendered to socialism. But despite the comfort, his loneliness deepened. His wife, living in West Germany, was unreachable. His letters were censored. He would write the same line again and again. "Tell her I am well." He wasn't. He spent hours writing military analyses for Soviet officers and reviewing old battle reports, as if trying to understand his own downfall through numbers and diagrams. And perhaps, in those quiet Moscow evenings, he realized he'd become a man belonging to no side at all. When Stalin died, everything changed again. The new Soviet leadership wanted to appear more humane, more diplomatic. Among the symbolic gestures was the decision to release a few high-profile German prisoners. Paulus's name was on that list. But there was a catch. They placed him somewhere far safer and far more controlled. The Villa of Obedient Silence. When Friedrich Paulus arrived in Dresden in 1953, the city still looked like a wound that refused to close. Rubble filled the streets, facades stood like ghosts of old architecture, and the air itself carried the faint scent of ash.
The battle ended in disaster for the Wehrmacht when Soviet forces encircled the Germans within the city.
8 years after the firebombing that had turned Florence 1945 on the Elbe into a furnace, rebuilding was slow, political, and uneven. Soviet-style apartment blocks rose beside the cracked remains of Baroque palaces, as if the new world were being built directly on top of the old one's grave. And in the middle of all that ruin, the East German government gave Paulus something that looked like a gift: a villa on Preußstraße 10, perched above the Elbe in the leafy district of Loschwitz. To the public, it was a reward for his rebirth as a man of peace, a once loyal Nazi commander turned anti-fascist voice. But anyone who understood how the system worked knew better. The house wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage. Inside intelligence circles, the property had a code name: Object Terrace. It sounded bureaucratic, almost dull. In reality, it was a listening post disguised as hospitality. Every room had ears. Wires snaked through the walls, microphones hid inside lamps, and even the gardener, friendly, punctual, was later confirmed to be an informant. Paulus wasn't the only one living in the villa. The Stasi were there too, silent, invisible, taking notes on every word that escaped his lips. Life in Dresden became a kind of routine exile. Paulus rose at dawn like the soldier he once was, polished his boots, organized his desk, and wrote letters that rarely reached their destinations. Every envelope was opened, photographed, resealed. His phone calls were transcribed. His visitors, few as they were, logged, timed, and reported. Neighbors occasionally saw him walking along the Elbe embankment, his posture still rigid, his face unreadable. He was often alone, sometimes carrying a walking stick, sometimes stopping to stare at the water for long stretches, as if expecting it to answer a question only he could hear. He had a housekeeper, a cook, and, on rare occasions, young officers from the East German Army who visited to learn from him. They treated him with a mix of awe and discomfort, as though sitting in front of both history and betrayal. The man who had commanded the 6th Army at Stalingrad, the same man who had surrendered to the Soviets in 1943.
In 1942, Paulus was given command of the 6th Army despite his lack of field experience,
was now delivering short, state-approved lectures on the dangers of fascism. His speeches were printed in small socialist papers, his image carefully curated to fit the narrative of redemption. He was the regime's favorite contradiction, a broken enemy turned model believer. But beneath the surface of this obedient life was something else, an unease that crept through every creak of the wooden floorboards. Paulus knew he was being watched. He sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if listening for a click behind the wall. He avoided certain rooms after dark. He wrote some of his notes in code, using abbreviations and phrases that baffled even the Stasi analysts. One visitor recalled that Paulus once chuckled softly and said, "At least the walls here don't shoot." It was a rare moment of irony from a man known for his restraint. Despite the isolation, Paulus never lost his soldierly habits. His uniform was gone, but his discipline remained. He cataloged old maps, drafted essays on military ethics, and reread Clausewitz until the pages began to yellow. But something had changed inside him. The man who once served Hitler with blind loyalty now served the opposite extreme, with eyes wide open, knowing full well he was just another instrument of power. He had switched masters, not sides.
Paulus, however, on the verge of collapse, weakened by dysentery, and revolted by the absurdity of Hitler's orders.
The East German authorities paraded him quietly, always with a sense of control. When Western journalists tried to arrange interviews, their requests vanished into silence. A few approved Soviet reporters were granted access, always with handlers present. They photographed him at his desk, the perfect image of an enlightened convert. Yet even these interviews betrayed cracks in the act. His words were cautious but heavy, his praise for socialism stiff and rehearsed. The eyes, though, those told a different story. He was tired of being someone else's lesson. And still, the Stasi files grew thicker. They documented everything: who visited, what he read, what he ate for dinner. Object Terrace is secure, one report read, as though describing a military fort, rather than the quiet home of a man who had already surrendered his army, his beliefs, and perhaps himself at night. When the city lights dimmed, Paulus often sat by the window of his study, staring across the Elbe. He rarely switched on the lamps, preferring the safety of darkness. Some nights, neighbors said, you could see the faint glow of a cigarette and the silhouette of a man who looked both present and absent at once. What was he thinking about? The men he left to die at Stalingrad? The oath he broke to Hitler? The uneasy peace he'd made with the Soviets? No one really knows. But his last years were filled with rumors, of secret letters hidden in the walls, of wartime diaries sealed inside drawers, of documents contradicting the official story of his conversion. The whispers became so persistent that even the Stasi began to take them seriously. After his death, they moved swiftly. The funeral was brief and muted, overseen by Soviet officers who recited pre-approved lines about peace and redemption. The villa was sealed that same evening. Agents catalogued every object, every paper, every photograph. The official inventory vanished into the archives, and whatever they found, or didn't find, was never made public. When the Berlin Wall fell decades later, and parts of the Stasi archives were opened, researchers discovered fragments of those records. Among them was a short but cryptic entry: materials withheld for state evaluation. No explanation, no context, just that. And so, the legend of the villa deepened. Some said he left behind a confession. Others believed he kept secret correspondence with Soviet generals that could have embarrassed both East and West. Whatever it was important enough to disappear. After the funeral, the doors stayed closed. When Friedrich Paulus, Dresden barely blinked. There was no mention of Stalingrad, no mention of the decade he spent in Soviet custody, and certainly no mention of the hidden microphones that had recorded his final years. The tone was polite, perfunctory. One more page turned in the thick book of East German history. His funeral was brief and carefully managed.
But they weren't on their own, because British intelligence and American intelligence reckoned that the Germans would win this victory within weeks, not within months.
A few military officials stood in stiff formation under the gray February sky, their breaths fogging the cold air. No fanfare, no salutes, just a muted ceremony and a simple coffin lowered into Dresden's frozen soil. When it was over, the small crowd dispersed, and that should have been the end of it. But the real story began after the mourners left, because almost immediately, the Stasi moved in. Within hours, Preuss Strasse 10 was sealed off. A black government car appeared first, followed by 2 trucks and a handful of plainclothes officers. They hung official signs on the gates: property of the German Democratic Republic, restricted access, and posted guards who didn't answer questions. For days, the villa stood silent, its curtains drawn, its garden empty except for footprints in the melting snow. To the neighbors, it looked like standard procedure, a dead man's estate being handled by the authorities. But then the nights grew strange. People living across the street reported seeing flashlights flicker through the windows long after midnight. A small convoy of unmarked vans arrived on more than one occasion, men carrying heavy boxes out of the house and loading them in silence. No one said a word, and yet everyone in the neighborhood began whispering. Why was the Stasi still there weeks after the funeral? What could possibly be inside an old general's house that required armed guards and nightly visits? The official explanation, when it finally came, was clinical: routine property reassignment and document recovery. Which sounded reasonable enough, if you ignored the fact that the Ministry of State Security classified the operation under confidential internal security protocol. That kind of secrecy wasn't routine at all. By late spring, a small team of Stasi officers arrived under orders to catalog and secure personal materials of potential state significance. That was the language used in their paperwork. Vague and flexible, the sort of phrase that gave them license to search every drawer, every brick, every piece of furniture. For days they combed through Paulus's study, his bedroom, even the attic. At first, the house yielded nothing unusual. Military books, maps, Soviet decorations, a typewriter, some personal letters. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be: the quiet home of a retired soldier. Then one of the officers noticed something odd about the wall in Paulus's upstairs study. Behind a tall bookcase filled with volumes on military strategy, there was a thin seam of plaster that didn't match the rest. They moved the shelf aside and found a narrow door, its handle rusted, its keyhole sealed with wax. The hinges creaked as they forced it open. Inside was a small, windowless room, heavy with dust and the smell of old paper. Stacked neatly on wooden shelves were boxes of documents, each tied with faded string. There were folders marked with the year 1945, others labeled in Cyrillic, and several envelopes bearing the double-headed Soviet eagle. One officer later described the scene as a library of silence. What exactly they found inside that room has never been fully confirmed, but fragments of later reports suggest the discovery was far from ordinary. There were handwritten notes, letters to family, and what appeared to be drafts of speeches Paulus had never delivered. Some documents mentioned fellow officers captured at Stalingrad. Others, more puzzlingly, were addressed to Soviet officials. And then came the shock. Among the papers was an undated statement, unsigned but unmistakably written in Paulus's hand. It condemned both Hitler and Stalin for the destruction of Germany and the betrayal of its soldiers. It was the kind of document that could never have been published in 1950s. East Germany, the Stasi officers reportedly called it politically sensitive. Their supervisors gave it another name, das Unangenehme des Feldmarschalls, the Field Marshal's problem. The files were sealed, stamped top secret, and ordered to be transported to Berlin under armed guard. The operation took 2 nights. When it was done, the house was left almost empty, its walls stripped of the past. The official inventory vanished into the archives. The officers who had handled the material were quietly reassigned. Within weeks, all references to the Paulus file disappeared from Stasi records, but secrecy only breeds curiosity. Within a year, whispers began circulating among East German military circles. Some claimed the documents contained private correspondence between Paulus and senior Soviet generals. Letters that contradicted official Soviet accounts of Stalingrad. Others insisted he had written detailed notes about his interrogations, and that those notes suggested he no longer believed the version of history he was forced to endorse publicly. A few went further still, saying that buried among the papers were photographs and coded lists linking certain Soviet officers to atrocities committed during the war, evidence so explosive that even Moscow wanted it erased. No one outside the upper ranks ever saw the documents, but the rumors stuck. When the Berlin Wall fell decades later, researchers combed through the crumbling Stasi archives, hoping to find them. All they uncovered was a brief reference from personal material of exceptional state relevance. Access restricted indefinitely. That was it. No files, no letters, no confession. Just a bureaucratic ghost haunting the margins of history. When those boxes vanished into Berlin's archives, so did a piece of history. But whispers from the inside began to leak. Stories of what might have been found. Where truth went quiet. The official line was tidy. Nothing of consequence had been found in Friedrich Paulus's villa. Just a few documents of personal relevance, the Stasi said. Letters, notes, a handful of military maps. Routine. Forgettable. But in Dresden, no one believed that for a second. Not in a country where silence was usually louder than confession. When something went quiet in East Germany, it meant one of 2 things. It was irrelevant, or it was dangerous. And in the case of Friedrich Paulus, it was definitely not irrelevant. Over the years, bits of information slipped through the cracks. Never from the government, of course. They stayed silent as stone. But from archivists, retired officers, even janitors who claimed to have seen the boxes before they vanished into Berlin. Some described notes contradicting Soviet accounts of Stalingrad, suggesting Paulus had privately blamed Stalin's interference for the German 6th Army's fate. Others spoke of coded letters to German officers still held in Soviet captivity, discussing their interrogations and confessions. And then there was the rumor of one envelope, stamped not to be opened, containing the names of both German and Soviet officers who had conspired in the chaos of the war's final collapse. Naturally, no one could prove any of it. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, historians raced into the newly opened Stasi archives, hoping to find the truth. They uncovered boxes filled with Cold War surveillance reports, propaganda manuals, espionage records, but nothing bearing Paulus's name. His file number appeared in several index lists, yet the corresponding folders were missing. Some archivists said they'd been transferred to Moscow. Others muttered they'd been destroyed long before reunification. Whatever the case, the Field Marshal's paper trail ended in a void. The mystery quickly split historians into camps. Each had a theory, and each seemed to contradict the others, but all circled the same central riddle. What was in those boxes? According to this version, Paulus had spent his final years writing a private memoir that contradicted both Soviet and Nazi narratives. He supposedly detailed Hitler's reckless command decisions and Stalin's fatal arrogance at Stalingrad, the kind of double indictment that neither East nor West wanted circulating during the Cold War. Supporters of this theory point to scattered archival notes describing personal reflections of historical sensitivity, which mysteriously disappeared after 1957. Others believe Paulus was holding on to more than personal writings. During his captivity, the Soviets had allowed him access to classified wartime reports and interrogation records of German officers. According to this theory, he secretly retained some of these, perhaps as leverage, perhaps as a private record of guilt. When he died, the discovery of Soviet documents in his possession triggered a panic in Moscow, and the files were quietly recalled. And then there's the skeptical camp, the historians who argue that the entire hidden room story was inflated Cold War mythology. They believe Paulus's villa was searched, yes, but nothing of significance was ever found. The rumors of secret documents, sealed boxes, and coded correspondence were embellishments. Stories born in the smoke-filled bars of post-war Dresden, kept alive because they made history sound more cinematic than it was. Each theory has its supporters. None can be proven. After 1989, researchers scoured every corner of the archives. The Stasi's gray buildings in Berlin-Lichtenberg, the military records in Potsdam, even the Soviet intelligence files released in Moscow during the brief window of openness in the 1990s. What they found were traces, catalog numbers with no contents, log entries with missing attachments, vague references to sensitive materials under state evaluation. One archivist described opening a 1950s box labeled Paulus, personal correspondence, only to find it filled with shredded paper. Another file contained a single sheet stamped "Transferred to Allied Authority, 1957," but no clue to which authority or what was transferred. Meanwhile, Dresden locals who had lived near the villa swore they remembered the nights after Paulus's death. Unmarked vans, guards at the gate, men in long coats carrying heavy boxes. One neighbor, interviewed decades later, recalled seeing faint lights moving behind the upstairs curtains at 2 in the morning. They said they were cleaning, she said, but no one cleans with rifles. In East Germany, no one asked questions like that, not if you wanted to stay out of trouble. Today, the villa on Preußesstraße 10 still stands, freshly painted. Cream, framed by trees, and overlooking the calm curve of the Elbe. The iron gate is locked, the garden neat, and there's nothing to hint at the man who once lived there. No plaque, no tour, just another piece of Dresden's reborn beauty. But for those who know the story, it's hard to look at the house without feeling the weight of everything unsaid. Historians still speak of the gap, a missing chapter in the post-war record. The Paulus collection, as it was unofficially called, never resurfaced in Moscow, Berlin, or Bonn. Not a single page, not a single line. It's as if an entire piece of history had been deliberately erased. And maybe that's the point, because in the world Friedrich Paulus inhabited, silence wasn't emptiness. It was control. Every word suppressed was a weapon turned inward. Whether he left behind a secret memoir, hidden files, or nothing at all, what endures is the absence itself. The East German state understood the power of that silence, and used it well. One historian described the villa as a house built on a whisper. The truth, whatever it was buried under paperwork, politics, and fear. Friedrich Paulus's last words are uncertain, but one remark from his captivity still lingers. When told that Hitler expected him to take his own life rather than surrender, Paulus replied, "I have no intention of shooting myself for this bohemian corporal." It was defiance, quiet, cold, and final, and in a way, it summed up the rest of his life. He refused to die for Hitler, he refused to serve Stalin freely, and yet, in the end, his truth, whatever it was buried for the state. The villa remains, silent and immaculate, its secrets begging the question, what's locked beneath Preußesstraße 10's fresh plaster and paint? What's your take on this? Share your perspective in the comments section.